How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. If this opening shot looks familiar to you, it's because I have used it before. Just last week, actually. I prepped 3 of these gladiators to be added to dioramas, but I only used 2 of them for last week's build. After all of the customizations were complete, I threw these 2 guys into an arena to duke it out against each other, and this 3rd guy is getting thrown into a proverbial lion's den. There was a little too much rump showing to take this guy seriously, so I covered up his shame using some green stuff. I also used green stuff to give him a heroic cape draped over his right shoulder, taking him from just your average ordinary gladiator to an average ordinary gladiator with a cape. Once the green stuff had cured, which took about 24 hours, I glued the figure to a painting handle and I took him outside to prime. I also primed a griffin off camera, who will be the antagonist of this encounter. I was planning to just paint this griffin as a fun personal project, but it fit too perfectly into the diorama that I wanted to build today. I'll move on to painting these miniatures in a minute, but first, let's build the battleground. My keen-eyed viewers may have noticed the fully painted miniature in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and that's because all of this footage was taken after I was done painting. I arranged the footage in this way to make a more compelling video. The goal with this base was to try and work with the pose of the griffin to create a compelling rock structure on the right-hand side of the base. I wanted the rock formation to have a menacing, spiky appearance, almost like a throne that the griffin perches on, waiting for warriors who will challenge it in battle and try to claim its gold. I was going to integrate more plaster rocks into this build, but after a short amount of time I realized I didn't have the shapes that I wanted in plaster, so I used foam instead. Speaking of foam rocks, I was recently made aware of a channel called Vasco Toys. He makes some excellent foam rocks for action figure display dioramas, and I was particularly impressed with an impact crater that he made. I'll link that video and his channel below. You should definitely go check him out after this. Once the large rocks were all in place, I ripped up some foam into small pieces of rubble and filled all the gaps in between. The process took quite a bit of time, but I'm really happy with how it ended up. It looks kind of like a realistic setting for a mythological battle to take place, which is what I was going for. After I had cleaned up my workstation, I glued the foam down to the wooden base using some foam-safe superglue, and that's actually what I've been using this whole time to avoid melting the foam. The next step was to add some texture to the back of the rocks and the side of the diorama using some Sculptamold. I mixed up the recommended amount of modeling compound and water, blended it thoroughly with my gloved hand. I took extra care not to get any of the Sculptamold in the details of the rocks. The purpose of the Sculptamold was to mostly create a nice cohesive look on the back of the diorama and connect all the rocks together and give everything a little more weight and durability. After the Sculptamold, it was time to protect the rest of the foam. I did that by mixing up some matte Mod Podge and gray paint and carefully brushed it over everything that was still pink. To get the Mod Podge paint mixture to flow a little better, I did spritz it with isopropyl alcohol a few times during this process. I wanted to have a little extra texture on the ground where the hero will be standing, so I used some texture paint from Citadel that cracks as it dries. I used a palette knife to apply the paste, and once all of the lower ground section had been covered, I left it to dry. And I encouraged it with a hairdryer. The Sculptamold needed quite a bit of extra time to dry, so I set that aside, and while it dries, let's go back to painting the minis. And while I paint these minis, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. When I started painting, I didn't just focus on the man or the monster one after another, but rather switched back and forth while I had colors in the airbrush that I could use on both. As the colors got lighter, they got further from each other on the color wheel, so I began to switch back and forth less often. If you watched last week's build, you may have noticed that that video and this video look very similar. That's because I had a trip to go on and I actually filmed them both at the same time. In fact, I painted all 3 gladiators and the griffin back to back to back, and the bases of each diorama were also completed back to back. Stacking footage like that was a first for me. It was a bit of a challenge to keep everything organized and sort the footage out afterward, but it did allow me to go on a trip without missing an upload, so it paid off in the end. I used an enamel pin wash to darken some of the recesses on this gladiator, which is something I saw from Marco Frassoni, one of my new favorite channels for mini painting tutorials. I switched back to the griffin at this point and began applying lighter and lighter colors mostly from the front of the wings in order to create some nice contrast between the feathers as they went back toward the rear of the creature. Once the initial values had been established, I went back and I gave it more of a golden hue using some Seraphim Sepia. Next, I used some Apothecary white contrast paint to bring out the details on the feathers, especially down near where they met the layer of the feathers before them. I wanted more color in the shaded areas on this eagle lion, so I mixed up a deep purple oil wash and I applied it to the underside of the body and the wings, and some got on the top of the wings as well. Once that was dry, I had a nice colorful shading that I really liked. I added another round of gold from the airbrush, and then I switched to a paintbrush to begin adding the edge highlights. I used the brush to finish out all of the details like the beak, the tongue, the eyes, the talons, and then some final highlights on the edges of those wings. With that, I was pretty happy with the results of this golden eagle-inspired griffin. I then moved back to the hero with the brush and began adding highlights to draw out all the little details and make those pop as well. With those highlights on, I was pretty content with the way that this guy looked, so it's time to move back to the base, which was dry and ready to be primed and painted as well. Because of all of the cracks and crevices and the potential for foam melting, I decided to prime this thing black with the airbrush. After the black, I began adding different colors to the rocks. I actually really liked the look of the rocks after just a couple coats of paint, but I got a little carried away with the light tan, which often happens, so I just decided to go ahead and brighten everything up further and bring back the shading with some oil washes. The reason I experimented and played around with the colors and values of these rocks so much during this build is because I kept testing them against the griffin, and he kept getting a little bit lost. I knew I wanted him to pop more than he was, so I played around until I found a color scheme that matched. It was a little less detailed than what I probably would have preferred if the rocks had been by themselves, but I feel like this combination worked the best with the griffin. I cleaned up the wooden ring at the bottom of the base with some black 4.0, and that was the last of the painting, so I cleaned up my workstation before installing the minis. I glued the feet of this majestic man-eating monster to the downward-facing side of the rocks, and then I glued the feet of the man to the base. Once those were both securely in position, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.